Alright, welcome back. It is an absolutely miserable day here in Melbourne. So we're leaving. Flying to Singapore, flying Jetstar. But look, that's not really what this video is going to be about. I booked the cheapest ticket, I didn't pay for entertainment, I didn't pay for any food, I did pay for a window seat, but that's about it. We will touch on the flight at the end, but let's instead talk about something a little bit different. So it's the 17th of May today, 2025. In 8 days, it'll be the 21st anniversary of the first Jetstar flight. Now look, we probably all have our own opinions on low-cost, cheap carriers, but here's the thing. Jetstar might just be the most successful low-cost carrier started by an existing full-service carrier, and I think that's kind of interesting. How do they do it?
Jetstar is, by all metrics that I can find, the most successful low-cost carrier that was started and is still owned by a full-service carrier. So how did Qantas do it? Why couldn't anyone else pull it off? And how did this lead to the grander saving of Qantas? I realize I've made quite a bold statement there in the title. Well, we're going to break this down into 3 distinct time periods, and I've given them all goofy names. We'll start with the Shield. This was the early days, the Jetstar founding story. Then we've got the Engine. This is the Qantas Joyce era. And then we'll finish with the Spearhead. This is all about the important role Jetstar is playing in the future of Qantas. Let's start all the way back in 1993, when a massive earth-shattering event occurred that would shape the history of the domestic airline market in Australia. 2 Aussies got a pint in a London pub. Okay, no, there's a bit more to it than just that. Brett Godfrey and Rob Sherrard were at a London pub in 1993 watching the Ashes when they came up with the idea for a new Australian airline. They envisioned a new low-cost operator that would offer single-class service with a single fleet type that could disrupt the big 2 Australian airlines. At this point, the domestic market was dominated by Ansett and Qantas. Qantas had just entered the domestic market after they had acquired the government-owned domestic carrier Australian Airlines, or as it was known for most of its life, TAA. Godfrey and Sherrard jotted down all their ideas on a beer coaster, but it would take a while before they could actually implement this plan. Brett Godfrey would first have to ascend the ranks of Virgin Atlantic, becoming their CFO by 1996, and after some refinements, he pitched the idea to Richard Branson. Branson was on board, and in November of 1999, the Virgin Group announced that it would establish a new low-cost carrier in Australia, called Virgin Blue. Godfrey and Sherrard were handed $10 million in startup capital and given the reins to go and make their pub scribbles a reality. The announcement was generally well received. People wanted a lower cost option, but it almost all went sideways when Impulse Airlines, a then regional player, announced its own intentions to launch low-cost services between Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane in June of 2000, with a fleet of new Boeing 717s. There might have been room for 3 carriers, but was there really room for 4? Well, the guys pushed on anyway and started service on the 31st of August 2000 with 2 737-400s. They launched almost directly into a fair price war. Virgin offered $99 tickets, Impulse undercut them with $33 fares. Qantas and Ansett also joined the party, doing some discounting of their own. All in all, this first year of service was not sustainable for any of the airlines, and Impulse was the first to crumble. They exited the Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane market in April of 2001, and then they sold to Qantas in November of that same year. There's more to this, but we'll loop back to it shortly. Now, September of 2001. This month undoubtedly changed the aviation world forever after 9/11. But even without this disaster, this probably still would have been one of the most pivotal months in Australian aviation history. And it all revolves around Ansett. I'm going to keep this quite surface level, but we'll dive deeper into Ansett in a future video, so make sure you subscribe for that. In February of 2000, Air New Zealand acquired the whole of Ansett. They had owned half already, but the other half was owned by News Limited. Yes, for many complicated reasons, Rupert Murdoch owned half of Ansett. When News Limited moved to sell their stake, Air New Zealand ended up in a bidding war with Singapore Airlines. They won out, but they massively overpaid. Despite losing here, Singapore Airlines still wanted in on the Australian market though. So in April of 2000, they acquired a 25% stake of the Air New Zealand Ansett combined airline, the most they could under New Zealand law. The problem here with Ansett was that they needed a lot of investment. They had a terribly problematic and mismanaged fleet, in part due to that News Limited ownership. Air New Zealand wasn't in a position to make these investments after they had overpaid for the airline. This meant that when that four-way battle commenced in the domestic market, Ansett was not in a position to fight at all. At the peak, they were losing upwards of $18 million a week. In order to fix all of this, Air New Zealand's board, along with Singapore Airlines, came up with a radical and somewhat insane solution. They decided to try and buy Virgin Blue. They figured that they would be able to sub in Virgin onto their biggest loss-making routes, and as part of this deal, Singapore Airlines was going to increase their shareholding of the overall entity and provide funding for up to 32 new jets that were very much needed at Ansett. It was a spend your way out of the problem solution and would have created an Air New Zealand, Ansett, Virgin Blue, Singapore mega airline. But it all revolved around getting Branson to accept the deal. After rounds of negotiations, the final offer stood at $250 million. This would have been an incredible return for Branson on the $10 million he invested just 2 years prior, especially for the guy who famously said, if you want to be a millionaire, start with $1 billion and launch an airline. He was seriously considering the offer. On one side, he had Godfrey, Sherrard, and the Virgin Blue management team pushing him hard to reject the deal. But on the other hand, he had the CEOs of both Air New Zealand and Singapore Airlines pressuring him hard to accept. In a phone call with the then CEO of Singapore Airlines, Dr. Cheong Choon Kong, Branson was told that he was going to do this deal, and that if he didn't, Singapore Airlines would destroy him and Virgin Blue. This was a particularly odd call considering that Singapore Airlines had just bought a 49% stake in Branson's Virgin Atlantic just 2 years prior. But Branson could see the writing on the wall here. Ansett was in a downward spiral that they just couldn't pull out of. And if Virgin Blue was able to just stay afloat, the returns could be significantly more than $250 million. And so, on September 4th, 2001, he did this.
Anyway, I'm off to England with my $250 million check, and thank you very much. I'm just joking.
I saw the name, mate.
It was seen on the day as a cheap marketing move and a questionable business decision. But within a week, on the 10th of September 2001, with the Singapore Airlines mega deal now torn to shreds, Air New Zealand, in an act of desperation, offered up Ansett to Qantas for $1. Rather obviously, Qantas would have to take on their debts, and the Ansett operation was losing $18 million a week. It was a long shot deal, but Qantas did seriously consider it for about 24 hours. They sent a few executives to New Zealand to run the numbers, but well, if it's not clear here, 9/11 happened the very next day. The uncertainty that immediately loomed over the aviation industry destroyed any chances of a deal going through. Ansett was placed into administration on the 12th of September, and the fleet was abruptly grounded in the early hours of September 14th, leaving thousands of Australians stranded both overseas and at home. The Australian domestic market went from 4 airlines down to 2 in just under 18 months. For Virgin, this was their moment. Pilots, crew, slots, planes, they were all readily available, and they seized the opportunity with both hands. Their market share went from just 9% to over 21% within 12 months. But for Qantas, this collapse of Ansett was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they now had a virtual monopoly on the profitable premium domestic market. But on the other, they were now facing a fired-up Virgin Blue, a popular low-cost competitor that they simply didn't have the tools to fight. And this is where we can finally start to get to Jetstar.
We'll get to that in a second. I'm starving right now. As I said, I have not bought food for this flight, but I can access Qantas First Class Lounge, which is a bit ridiculous on a $250 ticket.
Yeah. Lovely, come through.
All right, perfect.
All nights are ready for boarding.
All right, thanks. Bit fancy. That is a cool angle. It's making the A330 look tiny. This is ridiculous.
After the Ansett collapse, Qantas had a problem. Virgin Blue was now Australia's second largest airline, and they were playing a game that Qantas was not equipped for. The price game. I mean, they could just cede market share, but what business would willingly do that? So they needed a solution. They needed their own low-cost carrier. But for a legacy full-service airline, this is seemingly an impossible task. Qantas is pretty much the only airline in the world that has really succeeded here. But why? What's the problem? Well, there's 2 big issues. First, we have cannibalization. How do they make sure that this new airline wouldn't directly compete with and cannibalize the mainline Qantas business? And secondly, we have the cost base, and this larger issue we'll call the synergy separation paradox. How do you structure this new airline? You want to capitalize on the fact that Qantas is already a big airline with a big network, but you don't want to end up saddling it with the expensive cost structures of the premium carrier. Let's start with the cannibalization issue and a story about British Airways' failed low-cost offshoot. BA is particularly relevant here because back in the early 2000s, they owned a 25% stake in Qantas and were pushing hard for them not to spin up what would become Jetstar. In 1998, they created Go Fly. This was an airline whose goal was to compete head-on with the rapidly expanding EasyJet and Ryanair. It was generally a success but caused major headaches for British Airways. Due to heavy lobbying from EasyJet and Ryanair, the government forced BA to structure Go in a way that didn't allow them to have any control over the Go operations. They owned the whole thing, but Go had its own management team and board. It was made to be kept completely separate. This doesn't sound terrible, but it did lead Go to aggressively compete with British Airways directly on their short-haul flights, instead of its original goal of trying to compete with the new class of European low-cost carriers. Who could have guessed that it was a lot easier to compete against BA instead of Ryanair or EasyJet? The thing here was that BA was powerless to stop it. They had very limited control. This all culminated in a £100 million management buyout in 2001, which was then followed by an acquisition by EasyJet a year later for £374 million. British Airways started this whole thing to try and slow the growth of EasyJet, but instead they ended up making a bunch of executives rich and fueling EasyJet's growth. With this example in the books and many others like it, it was decided early on at Qantas that if they launched this thing, the route networks would have to be carefully managed to ensure that cannibalization would be kept to a minimum. And whilst it would have a separate management team, ultimate control would rest with Qantas's CEO at the time, Jeff Dixon. And now this cost base issue. How much do you separate this new airline from its parent? This was something that was very clear to the management team at Qantas after their first major strategic response to the incoming Virgin Blue. In October of 2002, more than a year and a half before Jetstar's first flight, the Qantas Group launched a new international airline called Australian Airlines. This was a revival of the domestic carrier brand that was merged into Qantas in 1992. It was positioned as an all-economy, full-service international leisure carrier, a hybrid concept that attempted to occupy a middle ground, but ultimately satisfied no clear market segment. It flew routes out of Cairns that were no longer profitable for the mainline Qantas business, to places like Osaka, Nagoya, Bali, Hong Kong, and Taipei. The big issue, and the reason that it ultimately failed, was that Australian Airlines' cost base was not fundamentally different from its parent. They operated a fleet of Boeing 767 aircraft sourced directly from the mainline Qantas fleet, and used Qantas pilots and crew, who had expensive contracts that reflected Qantas's position as both a premium and ex-government enterprise. This meant that they were never truly able to compete on price, and the Australian Airlines brand was ultimately discontinued in 2006. So it was crystal clear at this point for Qantas's management that this new low-cost carrier needed a separate, cheaper crew base, otherwise they would be fighting Virgin Blue with one hand behind their back. But how do you navigate the unions to allow for this cheaper labour force? The solution to this lay in that acquisition of Impulse Airlines back in 2001. For $20 million, Qantas removed a small competitor, but this also supplied them with the perfect building blocks for a new low-cost carrier. After the acquisition, the Impulse planes went over to QantasLink, but the pilots and crew remained employed by Impulse as a subsidiary of Qantas, at a much lower rate than the rest of the Qantas employees. Impulse's brief stint competing as a low-cost carrier in the domestic market meant that, legally, Qantas could just bring the cheaper pilots back over to Impulse, rebrand it as Jetstar, and start flying. And so the stage was set. Qantas was going to create their own low-cost carrier, and they had all of the building blocks ready. But who do you get to lead this thing? Oh boy, it's time to talk about Alan Joyce. In July of 2003, Jeff Dixon, the CEO of Qantas, picks up the phone and he dials Alan Joyce, who at this point was the general manager of Qantas's network planning. He offered him the job of a lifetime, the opportunity to lead the creation of a new low-cost carrier. Joyce, who was 37 at this point, was uniquely qualified for the job. He started his airline career in Ireland at Aer Lingus in the 80s and saw firsthand the rapid growth of Ryanair. He worked on a project there under Conor McCarthy to set up Aer Lingus Express, a low-cost offshoot. This plan was eventually scrapped, but it not only gave him an incredibly early insight into low-cost carriers, his boss, McCarthy, went on to be the second in charge at Ryanair for many years before he would go on to help Tony Fernandez launch Air Asia. McCarthy was an early pioneer in the low-cost space, and Joyce knew him well. He would later be brought in to consult on the Jetstar project. I do want to mention here quickly that there might be something in the water over in Ireland, because they seemingly pump out airline executives at an incredible rate, but that can be for another video. In 1996, Joyce made the trek down to Australia to work at Ansett in route network planning. He was there during their most chaotic years before leaving in early 2001 for Qantas. Joyce accepted this offer from Dixon almost immediately and got to work. The launch was rapid. Within 3 months of Joyce's appointment, Qantas revealed their plans for a low-cost domestic airline, and a mere 7 months after that, in December of 2003, they held a ceremony in Melbourne where they announced the name Jetstar and vowed that the airline would be cheaper to run than Virgin. Dixon rather poignantly declared that if we're going to be cannibalized, we might as well cannibalize ourselves. Jetstar would start operations with 14 of those ex-Impulse 717s. This was done to allow them to start flying quickly, but they also ordered 20 Airbus A320s. These were the intended fleet for the low-cost carrier, and the 717s were slowly sent back to QantasLink as these were delivered. But it's worth mentioning the decision to go with the A320s here. Qantas's domestic fleet is primarily made up of 737s, so why go for the Airbus competitor? Well, this comes back to that synergy separation paradox. Surely Jetstar and the larger Qantas group would save a ton on maintenance if they just stuck to a similar fleet type. This is true, but what Joyce saw from his years circling around the low-cost industry was that the most important factor in the success of a low-cost carrier was its ability to keep operational expenses low, and the biggest factor here was driving down labor costs. By going for the A320s, they could then keep the employee pools completely separate between the two airlines. This would also lower the risk of union action, as these pilots were flying completely different jets. With all that being said, though, it was not all sunshine and roses.
We sit there and say, God, how can we screw the Qantas pilots? We do it because we genuinely believe this is the future of this airline. For no other reason, and I'm sorry, I don't apologise.
The launch of Jetstar was truly a bit of a masterclass in marketing. I'm not sure about you, but I remember doing the Let's Fly Jetstar jump in the playground in primary school. And the ads with Magda Szubanski are deeply burnt into my brain. They ended up selling 100,000 tickets on their first day of sales, and the first flight between Newcastle and Melbourne took off on May 25th, 2004. They've been a success ever since, but how did they contain Virgin Blue without cannibalizing the main Qantas brand?
AQ7 QF291. They leave at exactly the same time.
So Qantas and Jetstar both fly this Melbourne to Singapore route at exactly the same time. So how isn't there cannibalization occurring here? Well, it all comes down to incredibly careful management, but also distinct separation in brand. The separation synergy paradox strikes again. If we go back to the beginning, back before Alan Joyce was one of the most hated men in Australia, he set up Jetstar to be a completely separate airline. They were based in Melbourne, hundreds of kilometres away from the Qantas head office in Sydney, and were for the most part allowed to operate autonomously, cultivating a distinct low-cost culture. Suits and walled offices were out, open plan offices and business casual were in. They also initially had a singular goal: to fight Virgin Blue, and that's just what they did. They started competing directly, flying the many price-sensitive leisure routes that the Qantas brand just couldn't operate on. As they grew though, things did become more complicated. They started flying routes that would directly compete with Qantas. So how did they manage this? Well, carefully. They would fly out of secondary airports like Avalon or fly outside of the peak business traveller hours. And I think it's worth resurfacing a point about Alan Joyce here. Before he was selected to be the CEO of Jetstar, he was the general manager of network planning at Qantas. He knew all of their routes like the back of his hand. Out of anyone at the company, he probably knew best when and where Jetstar should be flying in order to not impede on Qantas's most profitable sectors. With all of that being said, major network planning was still done at a group level. Routes are chosen in a way that they will always be complementary to each other, not competitive. But I think a bigger thing of note here is that Jetstar is just a completely different brand, and were intentionally kept to always be incredibly budget. There's no free food, no free seat selection, no free bags, no free entertainment, etc. Premium and business flyers just aren't going to choose them. And unlike almost every other low-cost carrier in the world that may end up getting tempted to attack the premium business market, Jetstar has literally no impetus to do this. That market is left for Qantas. And that is why we can see 2 flights to Singapore leaving at exactly the same time. The premium or business traveler is picking that Qantas option every day of the week, while there's still hundreds of people that just want the cheap and cheerful option. This whole strategy to defend against Virgin Blue worked phenomenally. By the late 2000s, Virgin Blue's growth had stalled. They had around a third of the domestic market, but that was it. Jetstar had done its job. The shield had worked, the threat was managed. That being said, Virgin was not a bad business up until this point. They were profitable, they had a strong brand, and they'd settled into this position as Australia's second airline. Brett Godfrey, who was still the CEO at this point, had turned that $10 million check, that $250 million early offer, into a $2.3 billion public company that had $700 million in accumulated profits since its inception. But the changing of the guards, the retirement of both Jeff Dixon at Qantas and Godfrey at Virgin would usher in new chaos. Before we get into that though, I do want to mention what these two have gotten up to in post-CEO life. Along with Rob Sherrard, they've launched the Australian Walking Company. This is a guided walking holiday company that offer, and I quote, exclusive multi-day guided hiking experiences. They all seemingly have a passion for hiking, and I guess outside of doing business, they actually get along with each other quite well. I've done my fair share of multi-day hikes, and it would be quite the scene to sit around with the ex-CEOs of Qantas and Virgin on the side of a mountain waiting for the jet boil to boil. Anyway, let's get on this plane and let's get into the Qantas Joyce era. Now we can get into this next section, the engine, and I'm really starting to regret these goofy titles now that I actually have to read them out. In 2008, Jeff Dixon stepped down as Qantas' CEO, and as we all know now, Alan Joyce was selected to replace him. But there was an internal controversy around this. At the time, it was seen that John Borghetti, the executive general manager, responsible for both the Qantas domestic and international brands, was the man for the job. He knew Qantas through and through, so it came as a bit of a shock when the board instead selected Alan Joyce. Joyce was down in Melbourne running his little low-cost carrier. He was hardly ever seen up in Sydney, and what did he know about the bigger Qantas brand? I mean, heck, he'd only spent a little under 3 years actually working for Qantas before he was seconded off for the Jetstar role. But at least in hindsight, the decision to pick him was a no-brainer. He had done the near impossible task of starting an airline inside of an airline, and at the time, 2008, the GFC was occurring, which decimated the international business travel market. What better person was out there to help guide the airline through turbulent times? This did, however, leave Borghetti in a bit of an awkward spot. He stayed on at Qantas for a couple of years, but his future growth there was capped. And so when Godfrey decided to retire in 2009, Borghetti jumped at the opportunity to replace him. He took over as CEO of Virgin Blue in May of 2010, and this is when the real war started.
Yeah, speaking of the next 10 years, John, you've got a little bit of work to do, I think, ahead of you.
It is so exciting to be part of Virgin Blue Group. I can't tell you how exciting it is.
It's often opined that Borghetti decided to turn Virgin into a more premium airline that could compete with the Qantas brand head-on. But this probably misses the final moves done by Godfrey. Just before his exit, he launched V Australia, the long-haul, more premium subsidiary that aimed to target Qantas's profitable long-haul routes to the US. And he also introduced business class throughout their entire fleet in 2008. They were already heading in the upmarket direction. Borghetti just accelerated these moves. So we have this period between 2010 and 2019 when Virgin and Borghetti attempts to take on the more premium Qantas brand. I'll skip over a lot of it here because it's not super relevant for our Jetstar story, but it basically didn't work. Those $700 million of accumulated profits from the first decade turn into around $2 billion worth of accumulated losses for the period between 2010 and 2019. This was Borghetti's time at Virgin. There was the crazy line in the sand capacity war that took place between 2010 and 2014, but I've covered a lot of that in this video. What I want to focus on here is Alan Joyce and the Jetstarification of Qantas. I want to make it clear here. I think a lot of people thought that bringing in Alan Joyce from Jetstar would lead to him destroying the premium brand. And I want to give him some credit here. This might be a big opinion, but I don't think he did, at least not to the extent that some people thought he might. But he did do some very controversial cost-cutting moves. So let's fly through the major ones now, and we'll start with the people side of things. From the outset, he was hell-bent on lowering the mainline Qantas labour force costs. Of course, this was a major focus at Jetstar, and Qantas did have problems here. As I've mentioned, they were an ex-government enterprise and a premium carrier, and this was all reflected in their labour costs. His first run-in with the unions occurred in 2011 with the infamous grounding of the fleet.
As a precautionary measure, we have decided to ground the Qantas international and domestic fleets immediately.
This was seen as an insane move at the time, but the board supported him, and it did allow them to secure 18-month pay freezes across key enterprise bargaining agreements. This was followed by the 2014 Qantas Transformation Program, which included the cutting of 5,000 full-time equivalent jobs. He didn't stop there though. In 2018, they outsourced catering to Donata, and then again in COVID, in 2022, he outsourced non-core ground handling. This led to the baggage chaos in 2022, when we all started flying again, but it also led to a court case that found that these actions were indeed unlawful. Qantas has agreed to pay $120 million in compensation for these actions, and they also face a $90 million penalty, 50 of which is going directly to the Transport Workers Union, with the remaining 40 million likely going towards further compensation for the laid-off workers. This is a relatively small amount when you consider that Qantas estimates that by outsourcing the baggage handlers, they will save upwards of $100 million a year in labour costs. All of these moves have carved billions out of the Qantas cost structure, but did he have to do them all? Well, this is a tough one. On one side of the argument, we've got the examples of United, Delta, American Airlines, Japan Airlines, Air Canada, and SAS, who all had to get to the point of bankruptcy in order to dramatically rework their labour agreements. Joyce didn't let things get anywhere near that bad. Instead, he proactively fought the unions head on. And I'm not sure if Borghetti or any other leader without the first-hand experience of the low-cost carrier game would have made the same moves. But on the other side of this, he did go incredibly hard and may have pushed things a little too far, especially towards the end of his tenure. The baggage handler situation is a particularly damning case. They not only made the moves to outsource, but when the court ruled that their moves were in fact illegal, instead of accepting the decision, Qantas appealed, taking the case all the way to the High Court. This prolonged legal battle is symbolic of the company's aggressive and uncompromising industrial relations strategy under Joyce. You probably have your own opinions on this, and please argue with me in the comments, but I think Qantas definitely needed to restructure some of their labour costs in the beginning, but Joyce just couldn't seem to stop. He's a bit of a wartime CEO. Let's do a quick sidebar here to understand our peacetime and wartime CEOs. This is a business concept, and like a lot of these, they don't always perfectly fit, but they might help us understand Alan Joyce. Let's start with peacetime CEOs. These are the types of people that optimize for growth and long-term advantages when the company's core business is healthy. They emphasize a good culture and they create very scalable processes. They take a winning formula and they're able to squeeze it for all it's worth. A great example here is probably Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. He came in at a time when the iPhone was leading the market, and he optimized the absolute bejeebus out of it. But as we enter a disruptive AI world, it's not looking like Apple is in the position to lead. In the airline world, we could probably put Tim Clark over at Emirates into this bucket as well. Emirates had a winning strategy, and he grew the brand into something that we all know today. Wartime CEOs, on the other hand, they're the types of people that thrive under existential threat or intense disruption. They're all about speed, centralized decision-making, and the willingness to cut, pivot, or break norms. Elon Musk is arguably the perfect archetype of the wartime CEO. SpaceX and Tesla have both been under existential threat for most of their histories, but I guess to even further this point, in Walter Isaacson's biography on Musk, he described a period in 2022 when everything was seemingly calm in the Musk empire. Rockets were launching, cars were selling, he wasn't yet completely hated online. And instead of just enjoying this or pushing those advantages even further, he decided to buy Twitter. He just thrives on the chaos. And I reckon we can put Alan Joyce into this bucket as well. He was thrown into competitive chaos at Jetstar, and then basically on day one of running Qantas, the chaos continued with both the GFC and then the Virgin Borghetti battle. He fights the baggage handler cases in court because that's just how he sees the world, a battle. But at that point, Qantas wasn't in a chaotic state anymore. They are the dominant airline once again, and Virgin isn't really a true threat. They instead probably need a Tim Cook, someone who can squeeze this advantage for all it's worth. I have an inkling that Vanessa Hudson could be this person, but we'll just have to wait and see on that front. Okay, Back to our main topic here though. Apart from just people, Joyce also made major cuts to fleet expenditure. And I think this one has quite a lot of relevance today. Throughout the 2010s, in terms of the fleet, all of the growth was occurring at Jetstar. I'm not going to say that Joyce favored his baby, but he definitely fed it well to ensure it grew up big and strong. This started in 2012 when he cancelled orders for 35 787-9s that were meant to be sent to Qantas, but he kept Jetstar's 787-8 orders in place. Jetstar, at this point, had expanded internationally, flying initially to New Zealand, filling in Qantas's unprofitable routes. But then they started flying more long-haul operations with routes to leisure destinations like Bali, Bangkok, Phuket, etc. They used Qantas A330s for these operations, peaking at 11 in 2013. But by allowing Jetstar to take the first Dreamliners, this not only allowed them to lower their operational costs, the Dreamliners are quite fuel efficient, it also allowed them to send the A330s back to Qantas, where the running costs were less relevant. This trend continued with the A320neos. Qantas placed a mega order for up to 110 of them in 2011, but Jetstar was the one to get them first, flying A321LRs and A320neos all before Qantas received their first A321XLR only a month ago now. And this makes sense in the purely logical, numbers-driven way. Jetstar is all about lower costs. It makes sense for them to get the fuel-efficient jets first, and Qantas, at least the international side, has struggled financially for the last decade. But for the Qantas brand, I would argue this is not a great look. All the new fancy jets are going straight to the low-cost arm, and mainline Qantas now flies quite outdated jets. Towards the end of his tenure, they did announce a big refresh of the Qantas fleet, with all of the XLRs and the A350s for Project Sunrise. But many argue these moves were late and will have the Qantas brand operating a comparatively old fleet on a global scale for many years to come. Joyce was pragmatic with Qantas, while it appears from the outside that he was enthusiastic for Jetstar. I guess to wrap up this section and highlight how Jetstar did truly save Qantas in the 2010s, it's a clear two-part story. First, Jetstar became the group's undisputed growth engine. While Qantas Mainline was trapped in a two-front war against Virgin domestically and global carriers internationally, Jetstar was the only part of the business delivering real expansion and a vision for the future. But its second contribution came in the form of Alan Joyce. By bringing in the architect behind Jetstar to lead the whole company, they imported not just a CEO, but a strategy for survival. The wartime decisions that followed were brutal, controversial, divisive, but they did rebuild Qantas into a leaner, more resilient airline, setting the stage for the dominant future that was otherwise uncertain. Let's dive into the future. We're now in a post-Alan Joyce era, and it's yet to be seen what Vanessa Hudson will really do with the airline. I think she's gotten off to a decent start, but hasn't made any bold moves yet. There was, of course, the old data leak, the cybersecurity issue, and apparently I'm now a bit of a player in this area. This is not a good indicator of their security practices.
9 News, your news tomorrow at 6.
Yeah, it's been a long week. That's why this video has been a bit delayed. But Hudson's handling of this was not incredible, but after seeing what I've seen at a certain company that I'll not name here, I'm not going to say that it was terrible either. They've actually been quite transparent about the whole thing. Anyway, apart from all of that, the business she's inherited is in a very interesting position. We've seen a post-COVID travel boom, and Virgin, after its bankruptcy and Bain acquisition, isn't anywhere near the threat that it was a decade ago. The money has been flowing, and overall, Qantas is a profit machine. If we break down their earnings into domestic, international, loyalty, and Jetstar, it looks a bit like this. Domestic is a cash machine. All is well here. International makes some money, but its margins are thin. This is where I think we'll see most of the change. Loyalty is a money printer. We'll just leave it at that. But Jetstar is the interesting piece of this puzzle. They've grown to represent around a third of the Qantas Group's overall capacity. But more importantly, they now have a higher operating margin than the combined Qantas domestic and international business. And I think over the next decade, this will lead to a fundamental shift in the way the group's international operations are organized. Jetstar has an internationally competitive cost base. They can compete with foreign low-cost carriers in a way that Qantas's international arm just can't. So I'm going to speculate a bit here. We're entering the Simon speculation zone. I think we could see a world where Qantas International dramatically reduces its network coverage and instead focuses purely on ultra-premium, ultra-long-haul flying. They're obviously doing Project Sunrise, but I think these types of routes will become the majority of their business, and Jetstar will become the group's significant international brand, moving the majority of passengers. This makes even more sense when we look at their future cabins. The Project Sunrise A350s are going to have a 40 to 60 premium to economy cabin layout. That's a huge leap in premium focus. The 787s and the A380s currently feature 30-70 splits, and the A330s are roughly 90-10. The thing here too is that 60% of the cabin that is economy on the incoming A350s is still premium. Qantas will be the sole carrier operating on these ultra long haul routes. This means that they will be offering a unique economy product that will command a premium price. Personally, I'm not totally on board with the ultra long haul flying. I've tried a few and I have to say they are rough. But Qantas seems to think that these routes will command a big premium, so we'll just have to wait and see on that one. And on the international Jetstar front, they've been making serious moves too. Firstly, it's the A321LRs. They've been used to displace the Dreamliners on pretty much all of the Jetstar routes to Bali. The number of weekly Jetstar 787s to Bali from Australia has dropped from 28 in 2022 to just 3 in 2024. This has freed up the 787s to operate longer routes deeper into Asia. But more importantly are the refurbishments that are about to start on these Dreamliners. Jetstar is more than doubling the number of business class seats from 21 to 44. But more crucially, they're also installing a proper crew rest area, something they skipped originally because the jets were only intended for sub 10-hour flights. These refurbishments strongly indicate that we'll be seeing Jetstar operate much longer routes in the future. Could we see Jetstar flying to mainland USA, India, or maybe even South Africa? All of these are currently exclusively Qantas routes. But if this ultra-premium Qantas international shift manifests, then maybe it's just more profitable for Jetstar to take them over in the long term. Who knows? This is all speculation, of course, but to wrap up this future segment and to continue to justify this video's title, I think Jetstar will be saving Qantas International over the next decade or two. It'll enable the mainline brand to morph into a highly profitable niche ultra-premium operation, while Jetstar does the heavy lifting of connecting Australia to the world. I do want to acknowledge that the Australian market is a little weird here, and while Qantas certainly had many inherent powers, from its history as an ex-government enterprise, they've been the recipient of many government handouts and would likely never be allowed to fail. But I don't want this to overshadow the work done. The creation and utilization of Jetstar is still a pretty remarkable story. At least that's the way that I see it. You probably have your own opinions. Please let me know how wrong I am in the comments down below. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed that one. I hope you learned something. If you made it this far, go follow me on Instagram here. Go follow me on LinkedIn here. Heck, at this point, my LinkedIn posts might not even be that ironic. On a bit of a personal note here too, it's been one of the craziest weeks of my life. I got into a bit of a fight with a gift card company and ended up on national news. I'll link those videos in the description if you haven't seen them. But rest assured, the flight formula train will keep on rolling. So I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.
Simon? Is that Simon?
What's Simon?
Wow, what an amazing day.